Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us for Xandor's talk on design systems. Before we start, if this is your first time, welcome. We've been running these talks and meetups as Cape Town front-end developers since 2012. And I can't remember how many we've done, but it's over 100 now, I think. But we recently changed our name. We're now FedSA, or Front-End Developers South Africa. And we formed a non-profit and all those kinds of things. Hopefully that will be resolved soon. We had a bit of delay with the registration because of COVID, but it's all taking place. So we usually do the what's happening at the end of the talks, but when everyone's not in the same room, it's a little bit difficult. So I'm just going to do that now, just to let you know what we've got coming up. So on the 21st of October will be our next talk, and it'll be, no, I'm wrong. On the 7th of October, we're having a talk/workshop, which will be run by Skulk, and I think Robert McLean, on an intro to Git. So it'll be right from the beginning, like assuming you don't know anything about Git. So that'll be on the 7th of October. Then on the 21st of October, we've got Rory Preddy from Microsoft, who is a huge accessibility advocate, and he's going to be talking to us about accessibility. On the 4th of November, I'm going to be giving an updated version of my layout talk, taking into some new things that we have, like subgrid. And then tentatively, we have a talk on the 25th of November on Angular from the guys at Luno, but that's not confirmed. And then we'll take a break probably in December and January, and then come back in February. We want to run a mini conference on inputs, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all things related to that. So if anyone would be keen to participate in that, please get in touch with us. Okay, as usual, we'll update things via Meetup and the Slack channel. So there's front-end dev on Slack channel where we post everything, but we also have a FedSer channel on the ZA Tech Slack, which I urge you to join if you're not aware of that. And then we also have a presence on the ZA product developers, which is a new kind of Slack channel, Slack instance, if you want to join that as well. The URL is zapd.co.za, and that's geared at product designers, UI designers, UX project managers, and so on. Okay, so that's all that's coming up. We can move to tonight's talk on design systems, and we're very happy to have Xandor giving us this talk to us. We all talk about design systems, but we've never had an actual meetup about them. So I'm very excited for this one. Xandor is a full stack developer with a bias to the front end. He built his first site in 1999. A lot of us relate to that. And since then, he's learned that Comic Sans is not actually a cool font. But is it? I don't know. Is it? No. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll hand over to Xandor, and let's get going with the talk on design systems. Thanks very much. Oh, sorry. I forgot. Sorry, Xandor. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Make sure you are sending them to everyone and not privately. And we will run over those at the end of the talk. We also you're welcome to also ask your questions as opposed to writing them in the chat. And we can run through that. I'll just ask you to please be muted while the talk is happening, and then after that we can have a discussion. Okay, thanks. Sorry, off you go.
Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my talk on design systems. This is actually my first talk, so please bear with me. Right, so who am I? My name is Xandor Schiefer. I'm a full stack developer, but mainly on the front end. I actually remember the browser wars. The browser that came installed with my computer was IE3. The default background was gray of web pages. And I remember IE and Netscape fighting it out, and we thought we had it really tough. trying to support those two browsers and their myriad differences. Little did we know. I currently work a lot with React, although, and I like it very much, but I'm not like React is the only thing you should ever use. And this talk isn't very specific, focused on React, but clearly I'm going to be drawing on my experience, which is mostly in React. So you can find me on Twitter at Zarin. I'm not really that great of a tweeter, but there you go. Right. So what is a design system? You know, is it just buzzwords? Is it just a current trend? And actually, to that end, I went and looked at Google Trends. This is from the last 5 years with the term design system. And as you can see, there's been like a gradual rise of interest in design systems. It's not really a new concept, but I think it's only recently gaining a lot of mainstream mind share. The Design System Handbook has a nice definition for us. It says a design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. But for me, I like to focus on the system part, right? Like it's a systematic approach to design. It's not just kind of slapping a bunch of things together. There's actual like logic behind it. There are kind of like, there's like this internal consistency to the way decisions are made. And that's what makes it a design system. Why would you care? Right. Well, it gives you consistency in your designs. It gives you velocity. It allows you to speed up the development, both of your designs and of the products that are eventually built. And I personally think they're a really great communication tool, not just between design and development, but also between all the other stakeholders that may be involved in your project. And we'll get to this a little bit later in the talk, but you're able to actually like show them, these are the pieces, these are the rules, this is how they fit together. With some of the more advanced tools, you can even kind of like let them play with it and see what ends up happening. And it really, in terms of your organization, it allows you to scale design. It allows you to move a lot faster. It makes it easier to bring people on board. It makes it easier to be more agile with designs, to switch from perhaps one product to another, although ideally you're not doing that a lot. Yeah. What it is not, it's not just a style guide, and it's not just a component library, right? Those things are part of a design system, but it's so much more than those things, right? Because a style guide is just a page or a bunch of pages that explains how things are used, and a component library is just a bunch of components that you can use. But a design system goes further. Now, some misconceptions about design systems, that they can be limiting in terms of like the things you can actually end up doing, building within. They can be uncreative. I think sometimes designers can be worried that this will repress their creativity because they're rules, you know, and I think it's kind of far from that. Whenever you're working in any medium, you have a set of constraints, and a set of constraints inform your solution and your decision making, in the same way that on paper you have a fixed kind of aspect ratio. You can pick whatever one you want usually, but once you do, it's fixed. Whereas on the web, for example, that is very fluid. Both of those things are effectively constraints within which you must work. And a design system is just another set of those. Now, the best design systems don't actually like force you to stick completely to what they have. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But certainly most of the time you're expected to work within their guidelines. Some people think that design systems can be quick. Typically, it's not designers and developers that tend to think design systems are quick. I've sometimes found that your more business-oriented people tend to think design systems are quick. They're like, okay, great, we'll build a design system and then we'll go build the product. And it isn't kind of like 1, 2, 3. In my opinion, a design system is something that's kind of like an infrastructure tool. You know, you build it so that it supports your other efforts. Also, a design system isn't something that's once off. You don't just kind of like build it and then it's done and you can now kind of, cast it in stone and not really worry about it again, other than to use it. It is something that's living and breathing. The requirements on your products are constantly changing. There'll be new mediums. Some companies are already having to design for like smartwatches and stuff. I know there's no new things, but I've never actually had to build anything for one. And as a result, you'll always be going back and changing things. Now, I found that in order to make a design system a success, you need to kind of like build a bit of a culture around it. And not everybody has to completely understand what a design system is, but certainly I think they need to understand the value of design to some degree. And it is best when they do, because then you can get a measure of support for it. It's really hard to maintain a design system when you constantly get pulled off it and you get told to just like focus on products instead, and you're kind of saying, yeah, but like this will support the product. And if we just do it properly now, then we can not do it 3 times later. And ideally you want to get some buy-in. If you can, try find a champion. If you are in a position of authority, be that champion. If you are not, try and find someone to be a champion for you. Try and get them to see the value. But do it anyway, because even if you don't have that support, you'll already be doing it anyway. You're already building the components, and you're trying to keep things consistent, and you're trying to communicate with everybody else. And although it's definitely a lot better when you have the backing of some big honchos, even if you don't, do it anyway. And that can still get you places. You'll still get some benefits out of it. Especially in that case, focus on the documentation. You should have more success, because if you make the right thing the easy thing, people are much more likely to use it. Yeah, so in design systems, like I said, it's more than just a style guide, and it's more than just a set of components. Ideally, they're built up of kind of what they call design tokens and sets of constraints. So it's a system. A design system is a system of elements and the rules by which those elements can be composed. Those rules in turn can also be used to make new elements. Like I said, good design systems don't constrain you only to what they have. They should allow you to, when you're presented with a novel situation, to apply the rules of the design system to come up with a solution that, although new, still is congruent with what's already there. It's a set of tools that can be used to solve your product's design challenge while respecting design invariance. So now invariance is actually not really a designing term. That is a programming term, and it really means something, or a mathematical term, it means something that doesn't change throughout the process. So this might be that, the color is blue for anything that's related to the brand, and it will always be blue. If you build your design system correctly, that should be nearly impossible to mess that up. And ideally, this is a bit of a mouthful, ideally, the technical implementation of your design system is built on primitives that reify those rules, automatically aligning the output with them. Now, reification, for anybody that's unfamiliar with the term, as I was only a little while ago, means to actually make a concept real. And since we as programmers, take a design and actually implement it, that's what we're doing. So if in the code that we use to build our systems, we actually encode those rules as primitives that we can use, then the output automatically aligns with those rules. And I mean, to be a little bit more practical about that, that means, for example, let's say you're using CSS. You could take your padding that has to be a certain size or multiples of a certain size, and you could encode that as a custom property, also called CSS variables, and then use that CSS variable in all of your design. You want to go even further, you can set up lint rules, but make sure that wherever you use padding, it's not a hard-coded value, that it's always some multiple of the variable, and that way you can ensure technically that it's always built with the design system's rules. Right now, there are 3 major elements, in my opinion. There's typography, there's space, and there's color. Now there are more, but when you're building a design system, certainly as a developer, I found this is where I spend most of my time. Typography, of course, we're relatively familiar with. There's a lot to think about. There's usually a typographic hierarchy of some kind, like how many headings do you have? What different types of text do you have in your system? You want to have a typographic scale, most likely for those. It just creates a sense of consistent rhythm. If you don't have a typographic scale, you end up with like 14 different font sizes that aren't really all that different across your project. And consistency is really key, in my opinion, with design, because if you don't have it, users just feel like something doesn't quite hang together. And they may not necessarily be able to point out or even consciously notice that this font size is 0.5 different from that other font size, but it just won't feel as competent to them. Secondly, you should probably try and think about whether you want your typographic scale to be viewport based. And there are some ways in code to, some systems, some styling systems make this really easy to do. Secondly, think about font stacks. If you're going to have probably some kind of brand font, that font may not load, or it may take a while to load on different connections. So you want to have some decent fallback fonts as well. And this is very important. Check your licenses. Because if you're creating an application or if you're creating a website, the license usually needs to be a little bit different. Just because you have a license for, to use it in desktop graphic design does not mean you can use it on the web. Secondly, just because you have it for your particular project does not mean that the next team can also just randomly use it. So wherever you're documenting this in your design system, make very clear what the license is if you have assets available, and if not, link to where you can get those. Right. Also, and this is one of my pet peeves with typography on the web, and that is that web line heights totally suck. Really, really, really badly. There, as you can see on the left here, there's a little bit of like padding on the top and on the bottom of every line height, and the text just kind of like floats in the middle. Whereas the way you think about type as a designer on the right here is like the top of the text is really kind of the top of your cap height, and the bottom is kind of like the bottom of the X height here. And it would be lovely if the web worked that way as well. And there is actually a way to deal with that. I'm just loading this web page, and these slides will be available later, and you can find the link there. But you can actually calculate for a font what those kind of adjustments are that you need to make. And what's really nice about this is you can see here between these two, right? You can see this text is not really very centered. Whoa, sorry. But this text on the right is, and that's something that you can achieve if you do it. So please, I'm preaching the gospel of fixing the line heights. Right. The next thing is space in design systems. As you can see here, there's a lot of different types of space going on between different components that we've composed together. And there are actually intelligent ways to go about creating systems that help you with doing this. First of all, you're probably going to want to create, just like you did for your type, a space scale, so that, again, you don't have like 15 different kinds of margins. It would be also nice if there was some congruency between your space scale and your typographic scale, so that things kind of feel like they have a consistent rhythm. I sometimes, depends on the project, like to have macro scales and micro scales. And by that, I mean macro scales might be for like big layout pieces, things that aren't going to be necessarily inside of some like tiny detail of a complicated component, but just thinking on a much bigger kind of thing. Like if I'm doing a big page layout or like a very large hero component, and I have to deal with that kind of spacing. And a micro scale is kind of for more regular everyday space inside of components. Also, just like line heights, web margins suck. Using margins on components breaks that component's encapsulation in effect, because a component should really be responsible for everything inside of it. And it shouldn't make too many, ideally no, assumptions about everything that's going on outside of it. And when you're using margins, that's what you're doing. You're breaking out of that component. On top of that, margins are hard because margins do a thing called collapsing, except when they don't. And the rules for when they do and don't do that are so complicated that there's like lots of tutorials about it. And, you know, you're never really sure when they collapse or when they don't. And there's like new properties being introduced all the time in the CSS spec, which sometimes also cause your margins not to collapse anymore. So you might add something for a performance reason, and all of a sudden it means that it's like creating a new rendering context, and now the margin doesn't collapse anymore. Yeah, if you've dealt with this before, then you'll be smiling on the inside. So what do we do instead? We use dedicated space components. Here are some examples: box, stack, inline, columns, tiles. I'm actually lying. Box is not a dedicated space component. It is kind of like a primitive component, but in my opinion, it's the only one that you should use spacing on when you're using it to design. So basically, that's just a div kind of primitive. Right. By the way, I stole those from a design system called Braid, which I'll mention later. This aligns more closely with how designers think about space. Think back to the first slide I showed. Up at the top, so for space, this one, right? You see how we've got something on the left and on the right, and that's kind of like one component. And then inside of here, we like got some padding, and inside of that, we've got other things. So the different colors kind of like show you what spacing, that there will be different spacing components used for that. Right. Space components separate the concerns of being a thing and laying that thing out. So it maintains encapsulation. It's really a little bit strange to get your head around. So if you want to learn more, just Google this. It's very interesting. Colors, right? So that's the third kind of pillar of most design systems. First of all, I would encourage you to use semantic color names, right? And by that, I don't mean like taking your hex code and putting it into Google and seeing whether it's like terracotta or like chartreuse or something else. But I mean, what does that mean? Like, call it something else. Like if it's a brand color, call it a brand color. Maybe it's the primary brand color. Maybe it's the secondary brand color. Maybe it conveys some kind of intention. And the reason I use the term semantics is much like in the semantic web with or semantic tags. You use it after what you're trying to use it for. Just because two things happen to look the same does not mean that they should be the same. For example, you may have a kind of informational color that is bluish, and you may have a brand color that is blue. They may, in fact, for the sake of consistency, be the same blue today. Right? So if you use kind of info as a color for where you're trying to convey this is an information box, and you used primary as a color for when it was the primary brand color, even though they happen to have the same hex code, if the brand color ever changes, or if the information color ever changes, you've got one line of code to change. If you didn't, and if you just colored the information box with primary, then yeah, you might have a lot more searching and replacing to do. Now, whilst the global search and replace isn't so hard to do, the trick is always like, whenever I do that, I'm never 100% certain that I did everything I meant to do and only what I meant to do. The next thing is try and think beforehand about tints and shades. So often with colors, what comes up is you want to have like maybe a disabled state or a hover state or just more variations. So tints and shades are one way to do that. Now, although you can use lighten and darken color functions in, for example, SAS, I'm not usually 100% satisfied with the output. They just feel like slightly off, especially the more I've lightened or darkened it. So you can handpick them and just put them in your theme somehow. Then another thing that I like to think about is contrast colors for specific situations, like for text. Like if I have a specific blue, I want to have, what's the contrast color for that? So that if I'm in a situation that I can just use that contrast color rather than like specifying white. The next thing is to actually check your contrast. There are color contrast checkers available on the interwebs. You can Google these and they will tell you whether or not your contrast is good. There are accessibility guidelines and rules around like how much contrast is good or bad, but certainly this is important to know. The second thing is, and then nowadays everyone wants a dark mode. So when you're creating colors, also consider dark modes, and also consider whether or not your contrast color should change when you've now turned on dark mode. Components. So components are like the heart of what you actually end up building UIs with. And I could talk a long time about this, but I don't want to take forever. One important thing to think about is you want to have variants, and you're going to want to think long and hard about how you expose the ability for people to access different variants. You can create a variant prop. That's interesting. The difficulty I find with variant props is if you have like two axes of variants, like you have a variant maybe that's primary, secondary, tertiary, and then you've got another one where it's like contained, outlined, ghost for a button, for example, right? If you only have one prop or attribute to specify what variant it should be, you need to kind of like, create, like do some matrix multiplication and get like all of those possible things as single things to try out. So otherwise I might do kind of like, well, importance and style or something as variants. Style is perhaps a bad word. Another thing that's interesting is an as prop. So have you ever had a link that needs to look like a button? And not just look like a button, there's also accessibility concerns around that. It should then act like a button in many cases. If you have an as prop, you can kind of say, cool, you know what, like here's a button, but actually be an anchor tag. So that allows a lot more reusability around your components, because you can't 100% predict in what context your component is going to be used. Try to make it as self-contained as possible. I really don't like components that require like global state or some other kind of global setup in order to be used. It makes it a lot harder to use, because now I have to do all of this kind of like extra wiring, and it feels like spooky action at a distance. Try and make it as self-contained as possible, and you'd be surprised how often you can actually do that. It just takes a little bit of thought. The next thing is to pass through any extra properties or attributes to the underlying element. The more that the underlying root element, the more that you do this, the more you can like leverage the existing features that already come with what you're doing. And especially if you combine this with an as prop, it's really, really wonderful. Somebody could feed in some component you don't know about at all that has extra functionality, and then add extra properties that component will recognize as well. And this just allows you to compose components even more. And this is React specific, I think. Pass-through REST as well to the DOM. So if there's any like listeners or other complicated things that need to be attached, this works in well. It's easy to forget. Then let's just take an example and let's look at a button, right? It's actually, in my opinion, like the most important component. And it's deceptively simple. I mean, it's just a button, right? Well, actually, to make a button, you need to decide about variants. You need to decide about color intentions. You need to decide about horizontal and vertical microspacing, border radiuses, shadows, font family, size, scale, weight, color, and treatment, and maybe more. Maybe you're using a design system where there's actually a little click sound, or there's other kinds of animations involved. There's like, in my opinion, a button is like the nexus of where all the decision making of a design system like intersects. and I, in some ways, like to kind of like therefore let that be the first one I try to tackle, so that I can actually like come up and answer all those questions. and do it in a single place where I see the interplay of all those kind of aspects of a design system come together. Right. The next thing is layouts, and I don't have too much to say about this here, but I'd like to try and separate macro layouts and micro layouts. The micro layouts are really kind of the spacing components I talked about earlier. Something like a media object pattern might be a micro layout. Macro layouts more about like bigger page layouts. Iconography is another part you want to consider about your design system. Whether you're going to have it homemade or off the shelf, whether you're going to do licensing, and then also I forgot to mention this part, but how are you actually going to do it? Like, are you going to do it as images? Are you going to do it as SVGs? Are you going to do it as an icon font? These all have trade-offs. I would generally recommend, if you're supporting modern browsers, please use SVGs. You can use SVG sprites to have it all load in one go. Otherwise, icon fonts is still a thing. The other thing is licensing. Much like with fonts, you often can't just randomly distribute artwork that somebody else has created unless you stick to their rules. And you need to make sure that you check those. Imagery as well. There's different styles of imagery, different types of art direction you can apply. What I mean by different styles is it could be photographic, it could be illustration, it could be 3D rendered. Art direction is more in terms of like what part of the image would you focus on. Video is also something to consider. What are the file formats that you're going to use? Maybe in your design system, you want to have rules around that. And again, licensing is something else to consider. Can you just like distribute those? And sourcing, like, is it okay to just use Unsplash? Or is there specific, like, do you have an account with some stock photography provider? This should all be kind of documented in your design system. Voice and tone. So not all design systems have this, but in my opinion, like, copy is part of your UI. It's easy to forget, and UI copy is also not like regular copy. I've seen traditional copywriters all of a sudden struggle with copy on the web. Animation is another thing to consider. Do you want to use built-in CSS transitions? Do you want to use animation libraries? If you do, should those be physics-based? That tend to find like they're really cool, but they're also like have a little bit more of a learning curve to use. And then this is a thing not all of you may know about, but there's actually a CSS media query called prefers switch use to motion. And this is a bit of an accessibility thing, where some people are sensitive to motion and movement, may make them feel queasy, or they may be epileptic. And they may have a setting set in their browser that says, hey, you know what, like, don't give me all the whiz-bang motion. It'd be really great if when we build design systems, we could respect their wishes. Now, technology. There's a lot of different ways to implement a design system, right? And first is the actual rendering of the UI, and how do you want to kind of like deliver the code for that. You can use plain HTML and JavaScript. And so this is roughly the approach Bootstrap takes, where they're just like, cool, you know what, like, here's the HTML you need to write. These are the classes, and these are the JavaScript libraries you need to load. You can use web components. So web components like show a lot of promise, but they also have like some serious limitations. Accessibility of being a huge one in my perspective. Server-side rendering for custom elements is also something I haven't managed to figure out. But at the same time, web components are very compatible with many different UI rendering technologies. There's actually a website called Custom Elements Everywhere, and almost like out of all the major frameworks, only React is kind of like lagging because they have a custom event system. React, of course, is one thing you can build, and I would like, it seems to me like most design systems are built in React. So there's huge like community, and there's a lot of resources for you there. Vue is another system you can use. I think there is one, Vuetify, which is like a material design implementation that's quite popular in that world. A lit element is a new thing, well, new-ish, by Google, that will allow you to build web components as well. Stencil is a very interesting project from Escaping my mind at the moment. They do Ionic, right? It's from Ionic. And what's interesting about that is you can write your components in JSX, but it can export them as web components or as React components or as plain HTML. So that also gives you some compatibility. And the reason why I mention this is because the choice you use to build your design system in will kind of limit the projects that can use it. So either that means that if a new project comes along in your organization and they need to use the design system that you've got, now they need to use the technology you chose. Or they can't, if you've chosen something like React and they want to use Angular, like it's just not going to happen, right? Like they can't use it. So either they now need to use React or they need to build it all themselves. Now you may have an internal policy that says this is our front-end framework, in which case go out, but it's something to consider. The next thing to consider is styling. Now you can use plain CSS or CSS modules or Sass or Stylus or some other kind of preprocessor, and that really does work just fine. Or you can use CSS and JS libraries. I don't want to get into the controversy around those here, but CSS and JS does have some interesting capabilities in encoding some of those rules that I spoke about earlier. It can make that a little bit smoother. Now, also supporting designers is another thing to think about. You may want to make sure they have some kind of UI kit to work with when they're designing things. And there are the beginnings of like integrations with tools where the code the developer's written becomes available in Sketch or Figma or that kind of thing. It's starting to happen. And it's really important because I've seen projects where you have a design system, you've chosen a design system, we've decided on a design system, and the designer just kind of didn't know. And what ended up happening is their designs got approved, and now I needed to kind of like jippo their design on top of the design system that we'd chosen. And there was a lot of custom styling on every single page. It wasn't really, I didn't get the feeling like it set us up. Document things a lot. Wherever you're publishing your design system, make sure things are documented, because that's the way you're going to be able to communicate. And Playroom is an interesting toy. I don't have a demo to show you with right now, but long story short, if someone has a very basic knowledge of JSX, they can use this to kind of prototype UIs using the real components that are in your design system. And it's like very, very, like it's got like snippets built in and auto completion and all sorts of stuff. Like really, you do not need to be a programmer to use this, even though you would be using JSX to drive it. Like it's very, very convenient. You should check it out. It's from the guys who make the Braid design system. Some other considerations that I don't have time to get into: accessibility in general. So this is not something that you should bolt on afterwards. Think about it at the start. Otherwise, yeah, you'll just never get there. Audio feedback. A lot of design systems don't necessarily do this, but maybe your app wants little, notification sounds or click sounds or that kind of thing. Browser compatibility is a big one. This may influence your technology choices as well. Mobile, and by that I mean things like touch interaction, not just the fact that it needs to be a responsive design, and performance as well. Internationalization. So try to think about this up front, because all of a sudden if you say, oh yeah, we're going to go and be in the Middle East and we're going to have like translations done, and all of a sudden like everything is supposed to be right to left instead of left to right. If you're using the new CSS kind of like layout properties of like start and end, great. That does it for you, magic. But if you're still using things like left and right, then you're going to have to like manually fix all of that later. Dark mode, which I mentioned before, is a consideration. And bundling. So when you publish your design system, right, it's got to be consumed by downstream projects somehow. And there's a lot of kind of like static assets involved, icons, maybe some logos, font files. These things, they don't just magically work in the JavaScript ecosystem. Like you're going to have to actually think about how to expose those and how to publish them. Like maybe they're just like static file downloads from your documentation page. Maybe you try to expose them and you say, cool, well, if you have Webpack and you set up these and these and these plugins, then it'll work for you. It's just something to consider. White labeling. So There are some styling solutions that allow you to easily theme stuff. Maybe you're building a product that's going to be resold, or that has multi-tenancy, or that clients will show it to their clients. You might want to have like theming as a capability. And then versioning. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with semantic versioning. For those of you who are not, the one-liner is the version number should reflect the type of changes that have been made, like whether those are just fixes, additions, or like something that needs that's such a big change that you're going to have to change how you use it. Now, when it comes to a design system, there's actually like breaking changes that are kind of just visual, that are just part of the experience that the end user gets, but that aren't necessarily a breaking change from a technical perspective. That is actually a link to some documentation that will tell you about that. So you might sometimes want to actually like publish a major version, even though downstream doesn't have to make any code changes. It's just try and communicate, hey, you know, there's like a significant change in the way something behaves that may not be something that you would have expected. So there are lots of examples of design systems out there. One of the better ones is called Braid. It's for a company called the Seek Group. They're mainly based in Australia. They do job sites. Spectrum, which has been recently released. This is from Adobe. It's their design system. Material UI is a React implementation of the material design by Google. Ant is, I believe, Chinese, but it's got great documentation, and it's also one of the older ones. Lightning is from Salesforce. And there are many, many more at Awesome Design Systems, like literally hundreds are there. There are also ways to kind of speed up the process and kind of get some building blocks so you don't have to build everything from scratch. So Theme UI is one that I used recently in the project. It's basically like very vanilla styled components, but it allows you they're designed for you to build your own kind of design system on top. So it's really nice because I got a lot of basic components out of the box for free. React is a little bit older. It doesn't actually provide you with components, but it provides you with some building blocks. So it's got like some code and some logic. It's also, I think, Web Accessibility Initiative 1.1 compliant. That's really great. React Aria and React Stately are two projects from Adobe, and they use those internally in their implementation of their Spectrum design system. That'll also help you with accessibility and like managing state. So you don't have to figure out, well, how do I do tabs? Or how do I do an accordion? And how do I make sure it's all consistent? You can kind of leverage prior art this way. I'm sure there's other projects in different rendering libraries that do similar things. These are the ones I know. The next thing is you're going to want to document the work you've done, and how can you do that? I personally use Storybook a lot. It's really great. It's got lots of plugins that allow you to do lots of fancy things. Style Guidance is another one, which is a purely React-based one. Storybook is very technology agnostic. And then Pattern Lab is one of the first ones. This was created with the kind of atomic design classification in mind, and it's still going, like they're still being very actively developed. The other thing is you're going to want to test your design system. One of the best libraries I've found to do this is Testing Library. Testing Library is very good at testing the effects of your UI rather than its implementation, which is a good thing. Then visual testing is another thing you want to do. That's the link to Chromatic. They're the people who build Storybook. They allow you to make sure that when you make a change, that is the only change you want to do. Like it'll actually take like screenshot of the previous version and the current version and like tell you this is the difference. And then you just say, yes, that's what I wanted, or no, that's not what I wanted. And you can automate this process with Storybook. The other thing that I include there, although it's not technically testing, is linting. You can use linting tools to help you with some accessibility guidelines. Like in React, there's the React accessibility kind of ESN plugin. And then from a styling perspective, like I mentioned before, you could use style lints to implement some rules, making sure that, like, let's say you use only the CSS variables for anything that's spacing related. Then you're going to want to distribute this somehow. Like once you've built it, how do you actually get it into the hands of your downstream project? Like how do you actually consume it? The one thing is you can just kind of publish these as NPM modules. And some people do that, one NPM module per component. or they just do the whole project and then you can import different things from there. If you've got tree shaking set up, that's fine. You can use Git. You could use submodules to do it. It's very painful. Try not to do that. But if all else fails, like it can work. Another interesting thing I did recently in a project is I simply used it as a regular NPM module, but I specified it using a Git URL, which is an interesting thing that you can do. So you can straight up consume the project as from a Git repo. The only trick is you're going to have to make sure that it's kind of built correctly. So if you're using like TypeScript, you want to make sure that consuming projects either know what they need to do in order to transpile it, or it's published pre-transpiled. And then the last one is a company called Bit. They have like all the bells and whistles for publishing your design system and your components. They really allow you to do a lot. Like the feature list is way too long for me to go through here, but you should certainly check it out when you're thinking about distribution. And then here are some resources. Atomic Design is a great book. You can read it for free online. It's by Brad Frost, who was a guest actually not too long ago. It's a design system Slack. This is a Slack dedicated to design systems. The link to it will allow you to sign up, but there's a huge backlog. So if you want to get onto the design system Slack, you can ping me on ZA Tech or on the ZA product, or just tweet at me or something, and I'll invite you. The Design Systems Handbook is the ebook that you can download from Vision. Design System Checklist is really nice. You can use this when you're kind of like trying to figure out like what you need to think about. Have I covered all my bases? You can use it almost as a bit of a roadmap. 8Shapes is a company that does workshops on design systems, and they've got a huge list of articles that are really, really, really good. And then the Design Systems book is a book that you can buy in Smashing Magazine that also does this thing. So there's just a few resources to go on there. And that's the end of my talk.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Cue the applause.
Any questions from anyone? Feel free to speak up or type in the chat.
So I have a couple, but I want to see if there's anyone else that maybe wants to ask first.
I have a few too.
I'll let you go, Justin.
Before I do, there was a question about Figma align height.
By James. Yeah.
Line height the same as the web browser does. My short answer is yes. I don't know if anyone else has any more insight on that. I did post a link to a blog post about that.
What was that thing I responded to that, but I think my response was mostly kind of informed by your typography talk, and maybe I just misunderstood something. But you did mention something about kind of a standardized way to do line height. And that is meant to solve some of these.
That Xandor mentioned.
Mm.
Yeah. There's a question from Johannes. Where does Tailwind fit into your taxonomy of design system?
So Tailwind is a kind of a pre-built set of primitives, in my opinion. It allows you to kind of like build according to the constraints that you have, and you can customize it to say, cool, this is kind of like my spacing, and this is this, and this is that. And yeah, of course, there's like kind of like they've chosen some defaults for you, so you can build design systems with it, or you can customize it. So it's, in my opinion, it's not really a design. It's not a full complete design system in and of itself, but certainly it's a very like decent tool to use.
A tool for structuring your components, etc., etc. Yeah, rather than creating the design system.
Yeah, and any utility first CSS approach would actually very much be in line with my thinking around, make sure that your design system is built on primitives that encapsulate the rules of your design system.
Anyone else with any questions? Scott, do you want to go ahead?
So this is always like this is always something that always comes to mind when talking about any type of design or system or so forth. Can you over modularize? Have you run into instances where you've kind of made your system too modular? And if so, kind of, yeah, maybe share a bit on that.
So I haven't actually really, I don't feel like I have run into over modularizing, but then I try to kind of, as in software design, I try to stick to that whole, like, you ain't gonna need it kind of thing. Like, obviously I want to try and make sure that, that I'm not going to place unnecessary restrictions on the people that are going to use my stuff, but at the same time, I can't anticipate all of their proper future needs. So I have this practice of saying, cool, you know what, I'm going to pass through the props. I'm going to accept them as props. I'm going to pass through the rest, and that's kind of it. And if I find I need more than that, then I just go and change the component, or I end up breaking it up into smaller bits and pieces. I'm happy to go and do refactoring later. And especially if you've got good structure and you've got good linting and you've got good tests, then it's not really all that scary to do that. Now, I have had the benefit of working on internal design systems. So everybody that has to deal with the breaking change just kind of has to deal with the breaking change. Whereas when you're doing something that's more public facing, that's perhaps not quite so easy. But even a lot of these open source design systems that you can find, just because they're open source doesn't mean you're allowed to use them. Like, just because Salesforce's design system is open source, it doesn't mean that you have a license to just use it for yourself, right? Like, you can certainly inspect the code and look at it, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed to act like your Salesforce. So even they, I think, if they want to make a breaking change, they can.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Like, don't be scared of that. If you're using semantic versioning, then you're communicating, hey, there is a breaking change here. Like, the occasional breaking change in a design system, you still save everyone else a buttload of time. Like, it's fine.
Yeah, so I think my question is more in the context of, like, over abstraction. So, like, maybe breaking things down to a primitive level maybe too soon, without kind of like necessarily having, like, enough clarity in terms of what exactly we're building and kind of what are the common patterns that are going to be used and so forth. I've kind of worked on some teams before where that has caused quite a bit of pain, where things have, but I guess this is also maybe more process question than a technical question, like in terms of, this is something I always keep on asking myself, like, are there dangers to maybe treating things in too abstract of a manner, as opposed to, like, you kind of have this, I think Brad Frost uses this analogy in atomic design, like this concept of, like, a painter that, like, he's kind of like up at the material level, like chipping away, and then he kind of, like, takes a step back and he, like, looks at the system, and then he goes in again, like that kind of interplay. And like, I've been in situations before where I maybe have spent too much time in the abstract, and too little time in the actual implementation, so that when I get to the implementation, like, I kind of run into some assumptions I made. So I was just curious whether you've kind of experienced this before.
Well, not so much, but just like I also said, I like to, like, for example, start with a button, because it's the intersection of all those different things put together. So if that's the first thing I'm building, I run into a lot of that, like, right off the get-go, before I've built lots of other things.
Cool. I have some more, but maybe
there's another question in the chat, Scott, which we'll go to, and then we'll come back to you. Cool. There's a question from Gerdus who wants to know, organizationally, who should be in control of the design system? Product owner, designer, etc. This is a big question. Important one.
I think that depends a lot on the culture of your organization. Really, like in my view, it also depends on what you mean with control, because it's like a toolbox, right? You need to kind of strike a balance between this kind of goal of shared consistency across different products, but at the same time allowing those products to still come up with whatever is unique for their situation, because you're not going to be able to create everything every product's going to need in the kind of like shared design system, nor should you seek to, in my opinion. And then the question is kind of like, well, where does the control start and end? Yeah, I certainly don't think you should kind of like do this in a vacuum either. You definitely want to get input from the designers and from like a head of design. Yeah, it's kind of hard to answer that, but like I do think it should be kind of like a multidisciplinary and kind of cross-departmental effort. Get different people involved, get them to champion their different causes, and try and work at being a team, because even though you've got different concerns, at the end of the day, you want to help the company make money using design in some way. So even if you disagree on some points, like you've got that shared value there, and work towards doing that. It can be a little bit difficult because people do have different and shifting priorities around it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Something I've noticed is, and a team tends to be a very US-centric thing at the moment, which is where most things start in, the field we work in. But is this kind of new role of design operations, where there's someone who is a manager but has a foot in both design and dev and QA and product ownership and so on. And I think we're going to see that more and more as design systems become the norm, and that kind of role, oversight role, lives in that kind of a structure. Yeah.
So I assume that would. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, are there any more questions? But go ahead.
No, I wanted to respond to that. Like, that's super interesting. I haven't heard that, but I assume that would be kind of like the design equivalent of like a DevOps kind of role.
Exactly that. Yeah.
What I've had great success with is kind of like, especially inside an organization, treating a design system as an actual product. But it's just your actual users are not the general public, or it's actually internally a product that's being used internally. So for me, kind of just that paradigm shift of, like you're actually dealing with kind of a user base here, that kind of has helped a lot, because that means you're kind of like trying to gauge, like, whether like the thing you're building is providing value, like, is it helpful to people? Do they have suggestions? Like you can go as far as doing like actual user testing and so forth. So I've kind of found it very helpful to use the same kind of conceptual tools that I use for like a client-based or a customer-based like product, like for internal products as well, including design systems. So my question specifically is regarding the get import. You mentioned in terms of packages. So I was super excited when I heard about that. I think one problem that I did run into is that it's not very easy to do versioning with that unless you're using branches.
No,
is it?
Totally. Yeah, I'll show you.
Because that is the thing that's been preventing me from actually pursuing that more, but I guess then I just kind of misunderstood.
Package, JSON, documentation. Hold on. And I'll bump the font size a bit when I get to the site. I'll package JSON, and then get. Get. Okay. Wow. do.
Get is a very well used word in
dependencies. Yeah. So do you see right here at the end, hashtag SimVer, SimVer.
Okay. Because
right. They have an example on this line here. So let me just X-nay this.
Okay, nice.
And you'll see there. And that works.
Okay.
That works. I was very surprised that works. You can also use branches. And one thing I like about this is it's much easier to test something locally, because when using branches, I'll like change the URL to a file URL. Like you go get plus file whatever your local path is to your local clone. And then the branch name that I'm currently working on or something. It doesn't mean I have to commit to that branch to suggest a change without pushing it. So if I don't want to push it, and like let's say I've got Slack integration set up and everybody knows I've done a push and there's something new to look at, like, when I just want to see if it's working. Right, then I can do that instead, which is a different. Like you could also npm link the thing. One thing to note, what I do is, like I said, you have to, when you publish, it has to be built, or there is something else you can do. Instead of building, because I personally don't like committing the kind of compiled versions of things in my Git repos. It feels dirty.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
So there were scripts, files, main, browser, bin, and blah blah blah, directories, repositories, scripts, npm scripts, documentation. Okay. Prepare. Where's prepare?
Second one.
Yeah. Run both before the package is packed and published on local npm install without any arguments, and when installing Git dependencies.
Nice.
So I have it as a prepare script. So I like the project I did it on last, we were using flow, so we'd strip the flow type and then use Badal to compile it properly. So that way that it would actually work that way, which was really kind of nice. It was the best of both worlds for me.
Yeah, that's because I didn't even think about that, because I guess you would treat it in the same way that, for example, if you just publishing a component that uses TypeScript or whatever, you include all the definition files and whatever. But so like including that in your version control, I didn't even think that now you need to do that, because you're actually pulling from the version control. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So Anders has put a link in the chat to a handbook on introducing design ops. So thanks for that.
Cool.
There's also an InVision book on design ops you can check for. And then some more questions. How do you prefer designers to hand over designs to developers? Are developers expected to open Sketch or Figma files to inspect mocked up components? And then Brett has mentioned Zeppelin with connected components, which is really great if you're using that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Xandor?
To be honest, I kind of really don't mind. If it can give me output that I can easily inspect, like I'm okay with that. If I'm building a design system, I'm unlikely to just copy paste whatever code comes out of a system in the first place.
Sure.
Something that speaks my language, that speaks in pixels and not points, and in hexes, the hex values, that's my jam. That's what I love, so that I don't have to go and like guess stuff. I just don't want to guess. Right. That's all I really care about. It's nice that those tools end up having, are closer to what I'm building. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned Playroom, right? Because let's say we're looking at a kind of like finished design for something rather than a design of some part of the design system, i.e. this design is just a composition of existing components that we have. If somebody's used Playroom, I literally can copy paste that code, because they would have assembled it using the actual code that is in the design. Which is really, really cool. You just kind of like, great, you just take out the placeholders and you start hooking up like some of the stateful stuff and that kind of thing. That's really useful. That was also designed by the guys who make Braid, and their whole idea is to to work as close to the final medium as soon as possible. I mean, sometimes even if the designer doesn't necessarily know JSX, you can sit there and maybe, like nowadays, you wouldn't be necessarily sitting next to each other, but maybe you jump on a video call together and you drive, and the designer is like, oh, try this, try that. And you can actually iterate much more quickly.
Yeah, I think Braid is amazing. I think they've done an incredible job with that. If anyone hasn't checked it out, I really recommend that you do. And also follow Mark Dalgleish on Twitter, not just for the memes.
It's good memes, yeah.
He's, I think he's the principal on Braid, or
I think he's the lead dev.
Lead dev, yeah. But he's also really concerned with design issues and questions. And his whole thing is, well, you know, the medium that we delivering in is the browser, right? So we should be designing in the browser as much as we can. And I think that's that's what Braid does so well. Yeah. Right, questions are coming in. Zeppelin, as an example, connected components. Zeppelin you can integrate with Storybook and everything as well. So if designers update like a sketch file and send it off to Zeppelin, and you've got all that integration, which is nice. Things are coming along in that respect. But here's the ultimate question. What is your preference on naming conventions for design tokens? And should they relate back to your actual CSS naming convention?
Yes.
The thorny one.
Always. Okay. So if you're going to have a naming convention, it's kind of useless if you don't actually have it in the code, because what's going to happen is you're going to hire a new developer and they might be junior, and they're going to see all this code, and they're going to be like, when somebody comes and speaks to them and says, hey, we need to change the foo file on the thingamajig, they're going to be like, yeah, but we call it a whatchamacall. So like, it's like a disconnect there, you know? You can't, like, and this also comes from like domain-driven design. You want to have like this idea of ubiquitous language, where everyone uses the same language and they mean the same thing. And the implementation uses those terms as well. You're going to have much more alignment and far less miscommunication if you do that. And my opinion on naming conventions is just an opinion, but beyond that, it is that it should be consistent, right? Far more important than what convention you choose is that you pick only one.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think this maybe, like, I want to maybe riff on that as well. Like, do you include like terminology or names of things in the actual system? Because that is something like I remember way back when I kind of read Abby Kovacs, like How to Make Sense of Any Mess. Like, she really hammered on this point that, you know, like in terms of information architecture, like just establishing shared names for things is super important. And I've kind of been able to kind of see the value in that. And I've recently started doing it in kind of my, so I don't want to say documentation, because I tend to mix my kind of design system and my documentation. It's kind of one big thing. But there I have a specific section about the names of things. So, you know, when I talk about drop down, this is what I mean. You know, when I talk about, like, obviously, like, drop down is not a great example, but like things tend to get a bit more vague once you get into like custom product specific things. Like, I know, like, the one thing that I'm working on at the moment, we have something called a property list, you know, like, so, but like, if you don't have any context, like, you're not going to know what a property list means, or like, you might even call it something different. So I think my question specifically to you is like, is that something, like, is the naming of things kind of the language that we use to talk about things? Is that something that you're actually documenting in your system as well?
If not in the design system itself, it should be documented somewhere. It might be an awkward fit sometimes to have it in the design system, because, like you said, that like it's a concern that cuts across way more than just the design system, especially when you're talking about terms that are relating to the kind of way that the idiosyncrasies of that specific business. It might not even, that, you know, like a property list might be something that's a thing not just in your products, like it's also a thing in, you know, somewhere in the accounting system and on a brochure somewhere and everywhere else. And that's a bit of a cultural problem to maybe sometimes get that alignment in the first place. It's not always that easy, but try and be as consistent as possible with it. If there is no documentation for it anywhere, it might not be a bad idea to start it in the design system. You know, yeah, usually the scope of this concern is much bigger than just that. But if you're starting from nothing, then yeah, sure, why not? Go for it. It's not going to hurt.
And then maybe just one more from my side as kind of to that point, you know, you're talking about like cross-cutting, like and like concerns and so forth. I've worked on a lot of teams where they kind of treat the canonical design system as a kind of a design file. Like I know there's a couple of these that allow that. Some of them have been shared on ZIPV, Justin, before. I think like Plant might be kind of similar as well, I think. So obviously I'm kind of in agreement insofar that like I kind of use Storybook quite extensively as well, and I kind of treat Storybook as my canonical source of the design system. Have you worked before where the design system is kind of not in code, and kind of how have you kind of navigated that?
Yeah, that's not an ideal situation, because if it's not in code and if things are being changed without like a clear process, and like if I don't know about a change until I get handed in the design system, until I get handed a new design that incorporates that change in one of its components, then I'm playing catch up the whole time. And it's really easy for there to be drift between my implementation of the design system and what is considered the canonical version of the design system. And I think, yeah, that sucks. It's not a great place to be in. And ideally what you end up doing is you try and like change the culture to have either more process around that or more understanding that, hey, look, we deliver in the browser. So, you know, maybe we should treat the canonical interpretation, the canonical version of something, you know, as the actual, like as close to the finished thing that we do, kind of the same thing that that Braid is getting at. Because in some ways it's almost like, you know, like you're treating a sketch as a canonical version of a finished painting. Like, that's a terrible analogy. It's the quickest I could come up with at short notice. Right? Because the fidelity doesn't match up with what we're talking about. But it's still the idea, right? Like the sketch isn't what actually ends up getting delivered and looked at. It's just kind of the plan. And that's, in my opinion, what the kind of design is, no matter how high fidelity it is. If I'm delivering in HTML code, then, you know, the design is just the plan for what it should be. It's not actually what it ends up being. Now, of course, I don't deliver a design system to users. I deliver a product to users that uses the design system. But both the design system as well as the product execute the exact same code.
Yeah, I think like sometimes I find that it's kind of hard for developers, for designers to kind of let go a bit, you know, like that's kind of something they want to own. And I guess, you know, like the moment you have it in something like Storybook, you have a lot less control over it. Like now you need to ask someone, hey, like the button needs to be blue instead of red. Like now there's kind of like a mediator between you and kind of the branding and whatever. And I think it's sometimes hard for visual designers, kind of, especially if they kind of consider themselves as kind of like the custodian of the brand, to kind of relinquish that control a bit. Yeah, like I won't say that I maybe feel as strongly as you in terms of no, it needs to be code. Like, but that's definitely my personal preference. But yeah, I don't know. Like, if I know 100% exactly how to navigate that space just yet. I don't know. Maybe Justin maybe has some insight, since I think he tends to be like more in the design space, whereas I think I tend to be more in kind of the coding side of things, and not so much time in the design.
Are you asking me? Yeah.
Yeah. Go. Your time to shine.
My time to shine. Yeah, look, it's a thorny question. I mean, yeah, I think the only way, if you're going to embrace a design system, you need to have like an interdisciplinary buy-in. You can't have a designer delivering something and they sit outside of this process, right? Everyone has to be involved, and there needs to be like I'm on. I lean on Xandor's side, yeah, that it should live in code, because our product and our users are in the browser. They're not in we're not sending them our sketch file or a PDF or whatever it might be. We're sending them a URL, right? So ultimately, the source of truth for how this product functions and how it looks lives in code, because that's how we deliver it. And yeah, I mean, as a designer, we can be a little bit protective, right, of things, especially if we design something that we think is really great and developers like immediately roll their eyes at the complexity required to render that or something, which all designers have experienced, and all developers as well, I'm sure. But yeah, the important thing is the team, and how the team is constructed, and how the organization, and Xandor, you talked about this a lot, how the organizational culture approaches the entire idea of a design system. You can't have a design system without a UI designer, a UX researcher, and developers. They all have to collaborate. If you can get that right, then I think you get rid of all those problems. Or you just force your designers to learn CSS, right?
Well, on some level, I think this is also a bit of a tooling question. As like in the beginning, like think back to DevOps, right? Where in the beginning there's the great big divide between development and operations, and now we've got things like infrastructure as code, and we've got UIs that can change what effectively ends up being a YAML file. Right? That ops people that can't just, okay, it's perhaps a bad analogy because most ops people can edit a YAML file, but they could also use the AWS console to make stuff happen, and it can feed back into things. And I don't think it'll be too long before we start seeing the ability to like specify a theme that's used in code, but then you're able to kind of like, use that kind of thing in Figma as well. And in the background, it's all CSS custom properties or something like that. They can't be very far off. So that'll be part of the solution, because I think having a lot of friction for a designer to actually end up changing something, because there's now this, they have to go through the process of getting developed to change it. Like, that's not great. Like, no, that's not awesome. That's going to slow you down as well from a design perspective. But at the same time, having drift between the actual implementation and what is supposed to be the canonical version, I think at the moment that's going to be a bigger slowdown. Now, I don't think it has to be in code, but if the canonical version is considered to be the design, that whatever some design deliverable is, then there needs to be a lot of synchronization and alignment between that and the actual expression in code, so that the drift or the lag between the two is minimized as much as possible. Now, the closer you work into the actual final medium, you solve that problem as well. And I think it's a question of tooling and a question of culture.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I also think the two design systems are, in a sense, in their infancy, right? And so is tooling, the tooling that we're using for design systems, and that's only going to get more integrated as we go along. We're already seeing it via, Zeppelin to Storybook and things like that. There are a few more questions around. One's from Ishmael, who wants to know, let's say you want to make your design system public in the same way Material UI does it. Do you custom design the interface or just use a boilerplate? And the example he has is catalog.style, which I'm not familiar with. You know, if you're using Storybook, do you just stick your Storybook up and it looks exactly like the UI you get with Storybook, or should you be customizing this?
I think it depends on the value I'm looking to extract from making it public. Okay, so maybe it's catalog build. Certainly, is that it? It depends on the value that I'm trying to get from it, right? Like, what am I expecting? Because Material UI, the React library, like that is how that's not from Google themselves. It's an independent effort, and in fact, the person, the lead developer of that, that's his living. That's how he makes money. Is from advertisements aimed at developers on the documentation, as well as some premium features that you can get, like premium themes, pre-built stuff. That's how he makes money. So he has a bit of an incentive to like make it shine and really have it be polished because it's his bread and butter. Whereas from my perspective, if I were opening up the design system for most of my clients, if that were happening, it would probably simply be because there are third parties that need to build something for us or might want to build something for us or something along those lines. And in that case, the value I'd be trying to get out of it is that they don't bother me on the phone or in Slack as much and probably and don't waste my time. And Storybook is fine for that, assuming I've done a good enough job just documenting it in there. Yeah, it really depends. Like, it's the juice worth the squeeze.
I actually read an article by Gina Ann recently who did the original Salesforce Lightning system. I think she invented the term design tokens, where she talks about how she loves looking at all these design system websites, and the design system websites are almost better designed than the actual product that they're meant for.
This is not the case with what's the Microsoft one? I think it's called Fabric or something. I don't know if you've seen that.
Changing it.
But like, sure, man. I'm not gonna lie. It might just be a personal taste thing, but it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence for me in using your system.
Incidentally, Gina Ann has just joined, I think, Asana as part of their design system team.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. More questions. How far away do you think we are from being replaced by AI? And if we are, who will become obsolete, designers or developers?
Okay, I think I need to head out, guys.
So, to be honest, I think we're not going to be replaced by AI for a long, long time, because in order to do what we do, you'd need what's called general artificial intelligence. Something that can actually be created and see like broader patterns without necessarily having like training and insight. And like, there is currently no clear answer on whether that is even possible ever, no matter like whether you have the biggest quantum computer. The opinion is quite divided on that. But even if it were possible, I think no, we wouldn't lose our jobs just yet. I think AI will maybe solve some problems here and there. And I've looked at demos of GTP3 doing things with the React components and designing stuff and generating code and blah, blah, blah. And I'm all like, yeah, this is definitely not there yet. They're very impressive demos, don't get me wrong. But you know what's been happening with software as the industry matures is, first we coded like using punch cards, because in many ways that system was inherited from weeding loom, and we used punch cards, and then we moved into doing things in binary, and then we had assembly, and then we had like high level languages like C and so on and so forth. And basically what we're doing is every single time we're moving up a level of abstraction, and design systems are like that as well. Like, we're moving up a level of abstraction. Instead of worrying about like, how do I write an HTML tag, you're just kind of saying, I need a button when you're using a design system to create a thing. But one thing we haven't solved yet is kind of like, cool, I've got this business objective that I need to reach using technology and visual communication. and how am I going to do that, right? And that's really the core value of a designer and also a developer. Like, how do I actually achieve that? Like, how do I achieve this business goal? Like, that's the core value. The rest is implementation details. And I fully expect that that's going to be done. The implementation details are going to be handled for us more and more, whether by AI or just other evolutions of software. But no, I don't think we're going to be replaced. I forgot the second half of the question.
Will designers or developers be the ones made obsolete? I think you've answered that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if AI ends up doing all of our jobs, design and developers are going to be some of the last to get overtaken, along with maybe researchers and other kinds of academics.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was laughing at his response.
Like the AI researchers who did research into what would be the job that would be replaced last by AI, and the answer was AI researchers.
Yeah,
but
they're biased in AI.
But I think it's also like important to kind of realize that, expectations also keep growing. Like when we're saying, okay, are we going to get AI to design a website for us? Like, are we talking about like a year 2000 website that's kind of like tables and sliced up images, or are we talking about like a responsive website and one with semantic HTML, or are we now talking about like, so the thing is, like, the expectations keep on growing. So like, even if like you get an AI to kind of do part of the process, you're just gonna have to do even harder work, like that just opens you up to do other types of work, which is actually maybe even harder. So your job might actually get more demanding. Yeah, but I like also like, I don't know if you guys remember that I've shared this quite a bit on ZITech, but it was called, I think, The Grid or something. There was this Kickstarter project, like from a couple of years ago, which was essentially, that was a sales pitch, like, and they want to kickstart like kind of an AI project where you just give it like the content and it does a design for you based on like parameters that you specify. And that was such a dumpster fire, like in terms of just like people coming out and saying like, what did you do with all of this money? Like the websites that the thing produced are like just absolute garbage. So I think we're still a very, very long way away from actually having to have serious discussions about job security in terms of design and development.
Well, I think if it happens, because we're going to be some of the last, I think the problems that would introduce for us will already have been solved, because like 90% of the world's population will have already got their job.
We'll all be on universal income grants, right? There's another question from Ishmael, this is another one. How do you sell a design system to stakeholders who don't necessarily see the benefit?
All right, well, so selling is all about seeing the benefits, but you need to kind of learn to speak their language, right? That's like, whenever you're selling anything, it's the hardest sale to make is to sell something to someone that doesn't realize they need it. Convincing someone that they need something is hard. It's very hard. Instead, they know what they need, and try to figure out what they need, and then see how design systems can help solve that problem. Like, do they have a need for consistency? Do they have a need for reliable velocity in delivery? Do they have a need for like less wasted communication, that kind of thing? And that's kind of how you do it. Like, try and figure out like some bottom line version of like how much money has been wasted on, I don't know, like maybe they ended up doing a total reskin of some product because it turns out it was a bit of a shit show when it finally came out. Had they had a design system, they wouldn't have had to do that redesign kind of thing. And then you just like add up all the developer hours and the project management hours and everything else part of that redesign, and you say, cool, well, last time this happened, it cost you X, right? So assuming I can come in under that, we can stop this from happening again kind of story. And I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but you need to figure out what their needs are and try and like also make sure that you can actually deliver on that. You know, don't just try and say, cool, you care about the bottom line, and now I'm gonna just kind of thumbsuck how the design system affects the bottom line. That'll help you get a lot more buy-in. But sometimes, yeah, sometimes it is just tough, and sometimes even though you do this, like just someone may actually end up even seeing the value, but there are other competing concerns, and you may not end up getting the champion that you want, which is why I kind of said like just do it anyway. Even if it's just for you, even if it's just for your product, and try and make it as easy as possible. You may end up finding that like that ends up happening. You know, like I don't know if you ever read The Pragmatic Programmer, which if you haven't, pick up a copy. There's now 20th anniversary edition out. And one of the things they kind of say is another approach you can take, and this depends a little bit on where you are in the food chain, is to not really talk about it at all. Like a stakeholder isn't necessarily, like it shouldn't be their job to worry about how specifically you achieve consistency and reliability and that kind of thing. And the example there is really around software reliability and whether or not you should write tests and whether you should ask permission for, hey, can we write tests on this project? And like, can we do test-driven development? And meanwhile, you just don't tell them that it's done until the tests are done. It's your responsibility as a professional, as the expert, to deliver to spec. You know, and that usually includes not having like show-stopping bugs. So like you can decide how to do that. Yeah, so that's another way to kind of do it, is to just kind of like not really bother them with that, because as far as they're concerned, it might be an implementation detail. What you do have to do though is manage their expectations appropriately, because if that means that you're going to, you know, if they're used to a certain velocity, even if the output isn't great, if there's going to be a sudden change in that velocity and they don't know about that, then what you've done is you've surprised them, right? And maybe their plans, but because you haven't communicated with them, maybe their plans were that they were going to have a subpar but a workable enough product by X date, and you didn't like tell them there was going to be a change in that velocity. Then yeah, you're not going to be very popular. So don't gung-ho it either, like manage up.
So I also have another question, like, would you say that all products, all sites, regardless of size, benefit from having a design system? If not, what would you kind of use as a rule of thumb to determine whether it's time to start thinking about a design system?
I mean, yeah, anything would benefit from a design system, sure, but there's a cost, right? There's a bit of a trade-off. Like I said, it slows you down a little bit, and there may be internal politics going on. But what makes it worth it? Look, design systems also kind of exist on a spectrum. I usually, any project I do, I'll start up Storybook, no problem. Like I go, you know, I use Yarn, add Storybook, bam. Like whether we have an official design system effort or not, I'll do that. Whether there actually is an official design system or not, like I'll do that. Because even if there's an official design system, there's custom stuff I'm going to have to do for this specific product, right? Where am I going to do that? I can't put it in the official design system because it's not part of the official design system. So I do that anyway. So yeah, but like, so there's degrees of it. I wouldn't necessarily call that a design system because I created 3 custom components for this project, right? But it shares a lot in common with that kind of thinking. So yeah, all benefit, but it's a bit of like, what's the degree? And I think, how do I judge that? I don't have a good answer. Experience. I kind of feel it in my gut, right? But there's other things too. If it's like a very small one-off project, like maybe your design system is just like grabbing tailwind, bam, and doing it that way. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I have a question. I'm not sure if you followed a little earlier in the year, or actually quite early in the year, there was how can I call it, a debate amongst some like heavyweights on about design systems when Frank Chimero wrote on his whole redesign thing of his site, and he wrote about the architect and the gardener. And he was like, design systems are all about architects, and it's rigid, and it's all structure, and there's no way to deviate. Whereas the gardener just, potters around until they come upon the right thing, etc. And then Jeremy Keith wrote a response where he kind of agreed. And then Dave Rupert wrote a thing called The Web is Industrialized, where he talked about we're all just cogs in a machine. And then Brad Frost wrote a response where he said, well, yes, but no, we're not really. It's agile, that's the problem, and not design systems, and so on. And I know you alluded to this in your very first slide, where you said one of the criticisms that design systems get is that they're not creative. Do you think there are ways in which they can be creative? Because I definitely think they can. And it lives around the culture that you create around a design system. I mean, there is something not creative about a button most of the time, but only if you're looking at it in isolation, right? As a tiny, whatever your hierarchical system might be. So I'm just interested if you have any thoughts around, how this can be creative, because we talk about designers and UI designers becoming intrinsically part of creating design systems, but we also want them to feel like they're not losing their creative moments and sparks and things like that. Like, we want design systems to be human, for want of a better phrase. Yeah.
So, this is actually, I like this question. There's a lot of dimensions to it. So I think it's certainly possible to build a limiting design system. So 100%. It's possible to do that. And I didn't actually follow all of the articles that you mentioned, but I'm going to hazard a guess and say that their opinions on design system is really more of a reflection of the types of organizations that they've worked in than it is an opinion of some inherent quality of the concept of design systems. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. And I think that's why you have a broad diversity of opinion on those kinds of things. I think part of it can look, like you said, like if you talk about creativity and you're just dealing with buttons, then in the context of that button, then the design system, there's only so much that you can do, really, right? But it depends. You see, like when I said a design system should be, built on primitives that are the implementation of the design system's rules. So what I do is I expose those primitives so that someone could build a totally new type of button that isn't officially part of the design system, right? But that still sticks to the internal rules. So if you do that, right, then you get to be created at the level of a button as well, right? So there isn't any technical reason why you can't do that. Like there might be a cultural reason why you can't do that, but certainly there isn't an inherent technical reason why you can't do that. Also, in terms of being creative at a higher level of abstraction, right? You're not just dealing with one button, you need to create an entire form. I think one of the things that really helps with creativity, or some of the things that really help with creativity, are actually documentation and good API design, right? Documentation in the sense of you want the people that are doing the designing to feel like they understand how these pieces can be used, right? That they really get it. So and like you said, it needs to be human. So as much as possible, that API should align with the way designers think about design. Now, the way you figure that out is by talking to designers, right? You actually need to talk to them, and you need to be open to their criticism, and you may have to do some hard thinking or collaboration in order to figure that kind of stuff out. And a great example of this is actually space components and the idea of having, for example, a stack component, because that is much closer to how designers think about design. They're like, cool, here's a bunch of things, and they're all spaced by X, right? That's not the same as you going and putting a margin of X on each and every single one of those, right? Like you have actually reified, you've made real, you've implemented this concept of a stack of spaces in between those. So that's that kind of thing. And then making it as composable as possible. If it's easy for people to understand how it can be used, and if the way it can be used aligns with their model. So there's this great book called the design of everyday things, which I'm sure every designer in the room is
Mhm.
familiar with, right? Where they speak about like the conceptual model and the mental model, and those two things should match up. Like, for example, how hard is it to open a door when both sides have like a handle? You don't know whether you should pull or push unless it's written, right? But whereas if one side has a handle and the other side just has like a flat surface, then you know you must push if you're on the flat surface side, because that's the only sensible thing you could possibly do. Or if you go look at your stove, if your stove is like 99% of all stoves out there, you've got 4 or maybe 6 plates, right? And then you have all the buttons for them in a nice little row. And if you're anything like me, you can never remember which dial is for which plate. Like I just don't. If you're on a well-designed stove, you'll see that those knobs are just ever so slightly offset to suggest a layout that approximates the actual layout. And then you just never don't know, right? So if you can get the API, literally the props of how your component works, closer to how a designer thinks about solving problems, how they would compose things, then I think you won't hear them complain about creativity a lot.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great answer. I really like that that space component, as you know, how designers think. A designer doesn't think this is a top margin of 6 rem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of developers don't even think that.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was just a lame joke.
It's bottom margin 3 and top margin.
So yeah, I've been reading. I never know how to pronounce this guy's surname, so maybe I'll learn tonight. John Madia.
I don't know.
Okay,
Maida,
cool. I never hear his name being pronounced. I just see it. So I'm reading his How to Speak Machine at the moment. I shared it in the text chat as well, and it's an amazing book. And like he actually spends a lot of time kind of, because he's a designer, and he kind of spends a lot of time like talking about like kind of he like concerns that he has for kind of like the design industry, and kind of certain levels of disconnect in terms of the materiality of what they are actually designing, and how like there's kind of just this expectation that, you know, a designer is going to give you a design and you're going to have to change it just to work with the actual technology. So yeah, I think that's an interesting space still, and like we're kind of coming to terms with that, like in terms of like how do you, because I think to a certain level, like our tooling has kind of run away from us in a certain sense. I think the things that we're building has become so complex that, you know, like the parts that we play are so specialized, whereas I think you'll see a lot of like the old guard, like maybe like what's his name, Jeffrey Zeltman and so forth, you know, like they kind of come from a time where you know, they did the design, they wrote the HTML, they set up the server, like all of that stuff. So the way they think about it like in a kind of a holistic sense, like you're kind of this person making these decisions kind of as a big like architect, whereas I think like those of us who kind of maybe work in the industry now kind of tend to work in a lot more like specialized roles, where you have like something I see a lot nowadays is like just 2 different design teams, one doing the lo-fi kind of work and the other team like doing the high fidelity type of work. So I think even there, like it's kind of starting to get like super specialized. So yeah, it's I think it's a hard problem to solve. Like we definitely, it's definitely, I think in my anecdotal experience, it's becoming more problematic that you have someone so high up in the kind of the thought and design process, that's making decisions that have a cascading effect down the product cycle. And I think maybe that speaks to it. But yeah, so I think we're in for an interesting kind of ride in terms of like how that ends up playing out in the next couple of years.
We have one more question. The one, yeah. one that has started a million internet arguments. PX, REMs, or Ms?
Right. So there's a great article somewhere by Chris Collier who used, it was something along the lines of like, okay, I'm a big fan of using relative sizing nearly everywhere, right? So sometimes what you might end up doing is using, so this pattern by Chris Collier, what he did is when you're dealing with a component, the root element of that component can be sized with an REM. So that's relative to the root font size. And then in there, you can use EMs if you want, or not, right? Like, because it doesn't really depend. Like, because it's all then related back down to the root font size, anyways. And then I use pixels for things that I really want to make sure like line up with pixels. So like a button border or that kind of thing. I'm very likely to use a pixel for, and yeah, I do that for several reasons. One, because in some browsers there's a difference between zoom and default font size, right? Mm-hmm. So you can zoom the page, and so the way, here's an interesting fact, the way zooming the page works, what the browser actually does to figure out what the size of everything should be when you zoomed, is it changes its internal reference point for how big a pixel should be. So the CSS spec actually defines a pixel. It's a certain angle, it's a distance your arm would move. Hold on, your arm would move if you moved it like just a little angle up, right? At like 28 inches, like that's a reference pixel. And it turns out if you have a 23-inch 1080p screen, a pixel on there is exactly the size of a reference pixel, assuming you put it at 28 inches away from your eyeballs. Then, because it's actually weird, it's like this angular measurement, right? So what they do is they actually change the size of a pixel. And that would change like what would be a border as well. And as a result, what ends up happening is those borders aren't necessarily as sharp as they would be before, because if you now like, if that's like zoomed to 150%, you don't have half a pixel, so it ends up doing things like subpixel rendering. And depending on what color that border is, it may act, because it's using subpixel rendering. So a pixel is made up of red, green, and blue bits, and now it's using subpixel rendering. So it actually effectively changes the color of your border slightly. And somebody who already has a visual impairment, in some cases, if it's somewhat of a lighter color, may actually have more trouble seeing that border now. I actually tested this with my wife, who I don't actually need my glasses to see. I need it when I'm working for long periods. My wife needs them to live. And I tested this with her, and she was like, there was a border there. I didn't actually see that. And that was really interesting. So for that, I like using pixels. I also use EMs for media queries.
Yeah.
And the reason I use them for media queries is because if somebody's got visual impairments, they may set their default font size differently or their default zoom size. It doesn't really matter. And if I change the media queries as well, then they're more likely to kick in a layout for a smaller device sooner than if I use pixels. And that's really, really cool because, you know, when they've really like zoomed in, it's going to be hard to like see where things are, and a layout that like collapses things down is going to be better for them. Incidentally, there is a really tricky thing with media queries. If you're doing like mobile first design and they just kind of like, or Matroish Kadol's, your media queries, the one just overrides things of the other, that's fine. But if you're using media queries where you're like, okay, I vary this, and sometimes it happens no matter how hard you try, you're like, cool, I have to be like this media queries from here until here and like nothing in between. If you're using EMs, you either have at the breakpoint a 1 pixel overlap, or you do minus an EM and you have like a 15 pixel gap at like default zoom, right? Between your rules. It's the most annoying thing ever. And you can use calc if you're in Firefox in that media query. Everybody else hasn't implemented that part of the spec. But there is actually, if you check out the CSS channel on ZA Tech, I actually wrote a little thing there because I don't actually have a blog. But I wrote a little thing there. I figured it out. You can use the not keyword to make it happen.
I remember reading that, yes. Yeah. Front end is so easy.
Oh, yeah. 2020, man. Front end became easy.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually started using a whole bunch of different units of measure that I'd never used before, like character, to limit character width. And then if I'm using grid, I just do whatever. Because grid you can mix and match, because you got the FR now with grid, and you can, if you want something to always be 100 pixels, you can just say make this only 100 pixels, and this 3M and that 1 FR and that 20%. I mean, that's a bad example, but
hopefully you're not using centimeters.
No. Yes, or inches.
Centimeters are great for print style sheets.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Centimeters, points, inches, all your real size units, great for print styles.
You need a print style, they're great for that, yeah. Okay, any other questions? No. Okay, well, thanks so much, Xandor. That was really great, a great talk, and I think we had a really good discussion as well. So thanks to everyone who joined and stayed till the end. We appreciate that. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you all on the, where's my notes? 7th for introduction to Git. We'll post that shortly. So thanks again, and thanks again, Xandor, for your time, and it was really great.
Great, pleasure. Thanks for letting me see.
Yeah, great. Thanks all.